Blessings, beloveds. Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer, with you again today. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you're enjoying my videos. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about retrograde planets, and this is an introduction, so hopefully this introduction will give you something to consider and think about when you're actually looking at your own chart with any retrograde planets that you might have, and of course when you're looking at other people's charts as well. Before I talk about that, I just would like to clarify something, because sometimes when I'm speaking in my videos, a lot of what I'm saying is not noted in front of me. So a lot of what comes through can come through quite spontaneously, and sometimes it can be taken out of context. And it's important for me to clear this up, because I don't want people to get the wrong message or to misunderstand something that I'm saying. And the point that I want to clarify is this. It's in relation to my last video where I posed the question, can we transcend our birth chart? And in my view, I said that yes, we can. There was a part in that video where I was talking about Venus in detriment, which is in the sign of Virgo. And I made a comment about Venus in Virgo not really being, or Virgo not really being the sign of love. And I think that was taken slightly out of context. So a person commented, and I appreciate that they did, because it gave me an opportunity to clarify that for that person. And you can see it in the video comments anyway, but I just want to expand on that just a little bit more. So what I want to say is this. First of all, first and foremost, that regardless of the planets and the signs that they're in for you, every single soul that is incarnated into this physical body has the capacity to love. There is no question of that, because simply we are all born from love, from source, from consciousness. So there's an inherent capacity there for each of us. So whether you're a Virgo, whether you've got Venus in Virgo, whether you're a Sun in Virgo, whether you're a Libran, whether you're a Capricorn, it doesn't matter what you are, what planets you have in whatever signs they're in, the capacity for love is there for every single soul. So let me just put that out there and make that clear, okay? Now, certainly, and I'm not going to unpack this any further, but certainly when planets such as Venus are in a sign of Virgo, or even other signs for that matter, every single sign has their own particular style or approach towards the Venus or Venusian components of our life, which is relationships, love, sharing, values, and how we share ourselves in a relationship, how we show our love and our care and our consideration. Now, just going back to Virgo, Virgo is not an overly expressive sign. It's actually quite shy by its very nature. It's a feminine sign, so it's quite internal. And yes, every sign does have its shadow side, and it does have its positive and, for lack of a better word, negative manifestations, if you like. So on a very positive level, you know, the Virgo love will essentially show up in the sense of practical considerations and care for their partner. So their way, perhaps to put it very simply, in how they show their partner that they love and care about them, is through perhaps doing a lot of practical things. So, you know, taking care of the everyday kind of stuff. Whatever your day looks like, whatever is involved in your day, you know, and I'm talking as simple as, you know, doing the dishes, taking the rubbish out, you know, just basic living. We all have to do these things. It doesn't matter how spiritualized we think we are or feel we are, or how conscious we are, or how intelligent we are, or whatever the case. These components of life are there for everybody. So we all have to deal with them in some kind of way. Now, you know, Virgo is a practical sign. It's an earth sign. It has many different qualities and characteristics about it, but in terms of it being in the sign of Venus, then on its most optimal, elevated level, its care and consideration and love is shown in the practical realm, okay? And, you know, it has the side to it where it can be very judgmental and very critical, because that's the inherent sort of archetypal nature of Virgo, and that simply derives from the fact that Virgo is a perfectionist. They are perfectionists. It's the sign of the Virgin, purity and perfection. So when someone has strong Virgo in them, they inherently, naturally seek to perfect whatever it is that's there in terms of whatever planet is in the sign of Virgo. So this desire to want to purify and perfect this aspect of life, when it's operating on an unconscious level or a lower level, it's going to show through in the unconscious way, which is in quite a critical, judgmental way. But I think that it's important to probably address that it's not a malice intention behind it, okay? It's simply that the eye of the Virgo scrutinizes and analyzes every single detail. And if it's Venus in Virgo, then it's in the relationship. It'll undo and analyze and try and understand everything that's going on in the relationship. And sometimes that can be in a very detrimental way, okay? But at other times it can be in a really beautiful, positive way as well, just depending on how that person is operating, how their Venus is operating, on the rest of their chart, on, you know, how evolved the soul is, etc. So I just wanted to make that clear, so that when I'm speaking about a planet in detriment, that it's not taken in complete isolation, in the sense where you're just looking at or assessing the planet in detriment and leaving it at that. You're not. You always need to consider the whole person, their whole chart, the soul's path, their evolution, their level of consciousness, their heart. You know, all these things need to come into it. So just to finish that up, every soul has the capacity to love. Okay, so I'll leave that there, and hopefully that clarifies the statement that I made about Venus in Virgo. All right, thank you. Now, moving on into retrograde planets. There's a lot to be said, however, this is an introduction, so I'm just going to point to some highlights that you can start to reflect on and consider if you already haven't. So, well, first of all, you know, retrograde planets is a phenomena that occurs with every single planet except the Sun and the Moon. The Sun and the Moon are the only two bodies that do not appear to move in retrograde motion. From Mercury right through to Pluto, all those planets can be found in a retrograde position throughout their cycles in given times, depending on the planet and how fast it's moving and how slow it's moving, etc. Some planets have frequent retrograde cycles, some planets have less retrograde cycles, some planets stay in retrograde periods much longer than others, etc. Obviously, the slower moving planets from Uranus out through to Pluto, those transpersonal planets tend to stay in retrograde periods much longer because they move much slower. Now, retrograde is not a literal, retrograde implies that the planet has actually stopped in its forward motion and has begun to appear to move backwards. That's what retrograde means. But that's an astronomical illusion from the point of view of where we stand here on Earth, because in actual fact the planets don't move backwards, they appear to. However, the astrological and psychological meaning to a retrograde planet is there and is valid, and certainly expresses a lot of things about a retrograde planet. We also have stationary periods where the planet actually appears to not be moving at all. That's another phenomena, and that's part of the retrograde cycle. Okay, so very simply put, a retrograde planet is essentially a planet that works on an internal level. So whatever planet is retrograde whatever that planet represents, its attributes, characteristics, and its inherent archetypal nature, is internalized essentially for the person. So if it's Mercury, it's the mental function. If it's Mars, it's the drives, the desires, the sexual energy, and so forth. Now, the retrograde function, because it internalizes the energy, it actually has that capacity to go quite deep with that energy. And in fact, that is the actual intention and purpose. When a planet is retrograde, it's like the message is like the person needs to actually go within and understand that energy on a much deeper level. It's almost like in a previous life, you could say, that particular planet and that particular archetypal energy was perhaps expressed or explored or used in a superficial, surface level way. So the person comes back into this incarnation, and that particular planet is now retrograde, meaning internalized, meaning that this person now has to learn how to access this energy internally. And it's a very deep process, and it's quite a long process. So generally, people with retrograde planets, when they're quite young especially, it can be very difficult to access that energy and to actualize it and externalize it, because they need to understand the deeper level of it and the internalized process of it. And certainly when we're young children and even young adults, that's not easy to do, because we're talking about unconscious and subconscious states, and those states are much more difficult to understand or to even reach or to connect to. So as we continue to mature through our life and to grow through our experiences, that retrograde planet begins to blossom, as it were. And actually, people with retrograde planets can often be the people that are late bloomers in life. So whatever that planet represents in the person's life, it could mean that level of life connecting to that planet takes some time to actualize, to individuate, and to work through. Jeffrey Wolf Green, through his evolutionary astrology model, says in one of his books that retrograde planets are pretty much the things that I've just said, but in addition, what he says is that the energy operates on quite a different level, and the soul with a retrograde planet is often not connected to the consensus, to the consensus. So it can be then that this person's retrograde planet can appear to be to come across in quite a rebellious way to the consensus sort of form of things. And I think those people are actually lucky if they've got planets retrograde in that it takes them into a much deeper level of consciousness and understanding, and they're not influenced to want to conform to the external societal structures. They're more inclined to actually be disconnected from that, essentially, and be operating and working on a very different level with the planet that is retrograde. So the retrograde planet acts in quite a different way to what that planet would normally act if it was in its direct motion. And as a result of that, it can also be frequently, the person can feel misunderstood and not easily accepted by the people around them or their environment, and certainly the consensus world, as it were, because this person is coming from a much deeper level of intention and consciousness and ultimately expression. The retrograde planet is not often readily expressed externally. It remains operating on a quite an internal level. It's introspective, it's reflective, and as a result, it can actually create a really powerful illumination internally for the person. But this is a journey that takes quite some time. And another way of understanding this is like when a planet is moving direct, you could almost say that it's in that Aries phase at 0 degrees Aries, which is the emergence of the consciousness of that archetypal energy. So it's in its full expression out there in the world. And the retrograde would be more like a Pisces sort of phase, 12th house Neptune energy, where it was at Aries and it's decided to turn back and go back into what we call the unfinished world, the unfinished business, the unfinished realm, which is Pisces. Pisces is always the incomplete, unfinished. Its purpose is to complete things, but it hasn't done that yet. It does that when it leaves Pisces and goes into Aries, and the whole new birth cycle begins. So you could say that a retrograde energy is very similar to a Pisces 12th house type of energy. And if it's at the very late degree, at the end of a sign, so say 29 degrees of a sign, there can be quite a strong karmic implication with this particular planet, placing even more importance on it in terms of what it needs to do internally and the work that the person needs to do internally, and the unfinished business, if you like, from a previous life that really needs to be attended to this lifetime. So they're the main sort of points of how to understand a retrograde planet. When a person has quite a few retrograde planets, excluding the 3 transpersonal outer planets, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, so from Mercury through to Saturn, if you had a lot of planets retrograde between Mercury and Saturn, this person is really probably working behind the scenes quite a lot. So what you're seeing on the surface level in this person's life is not reflecting how this person really feels and what they're actually going through on a soul level, and what they're really working through on very deep levels as well, because they're operating behind the scenes. And even those that are closest to them in their life, their lover or their partner, may not even get to see components of this particular person who has a lot of retrograde planets, because they don't necessarily need to share these components of themselves with their partner. It's something very private and personal that the individual, that the soul, needs to resolve and work through and illuminate and make conscious. And again, as I said, this takes quite some time to work through. So hence, as I said before, it can be the late bloomer in life in terms of perhaps what this planet represents on that external level, and how that planetary energy is individuated or activated and expressed internally, and therefore enabling the person to achieve and create on that external level. But their primary desire is not about that external recognition or achievement. It's all an internal process and life, you could say, and it's very, very private. I have made some notes. So I'm just checking to see. Yeah. Okay, I've pretty much covered. Just bear with me, guys. And also, retrograde planets are very strongly linked, and I've sort of touched on this not directly, but retrograde planets are a very strong component of the soul's evolution, the soul's evolutionary path. And that makes sense, doesn't it, when you think about the fact that retrograde planets really cause a person to Well, to internalize the energy essentially, and that's happening unconsciously. There's not a consciousness about that necessarily, particularly when the person is young. But as they, begin to mature and grow, there is a sense of awareness that begins to awaken within the person about the retrograde planet, and that awareness, it becomes a really strong illumination as they mature and grow and individuate. But it's a very subtle energy. The way a retrograde planet operates is very, very subtle. It's not an overt energy at all. It's not externalized. It's all internal. There's great consideration going on for the soul and the planet that is in retrograde, that particular energy, whatever that planet is. The soul has to take deep reflective consideration to how they're going to use that energy, how they're going to integrate it externally, and how it's going to be expressed. And of course, depending on which planet we're talking about, that will then determine the various components of what that planet represents. So if it's Mercury, the mind; if it's Mars, the desires, initiation, courage, etc. If it's Venus, then it's the values, the sharing of the love, relationships, etc. And a retrograde planet is not implying that the planet is weak in any way, shape or form, by the way. Retrograde planets are in fact very, very powerful. They just operate on a very different level to a direct planet, because the energy is focused internally. Retrograde planets can also make the soul very, very receptive to inner currents and undercurrents of life, which connects to the collective or collective unconscious. So there is an undercurrent collectively that we are all tuned in with on some level. Some of us are more aware of that and some of us are less aware of that. I think people with retrograde planets have an inherent sensitivity to these, first of all, inner currents of the internal life, the soul life, the spiritual life, and then the collective unconscious undercurrents or inner currents as well. And also retrograde planets can indicate highly individualized, specialized abilities in a person as well, so depending on the planet in question. But there's something quite special about retrograde planets, so you might not read that in a lot of books, but it's important to understand. And the person is, as I said before, they're not going to be molded and shaped by social structures. They're going to do it in their own way, as it were. That's why doing it in their own way, with conscious consideration and reflection, not in an ego, selfish, self-centered way, because that won't work. So this deeper, more conscious, reflective, considered way connects more to the humanitarian sort of element of life. So perhaps when they mature this energy and develop it on an external level, they may be one of those people that's very driven and motivated to use that energy for a cause that connects to the world and some kind of cause that is about making powerful changes in the world, bringing more consciousness through to awaken people and so forth. So Mars and Sagittarius, that I would think that would be, if Mars and Sagittarius is retrograde, that could be the person that works very, very intensely, personally with that Sagittarian archetypal energy, which is about truth, wisdom, consciousness, expansion. And then, the Mars is that drive and desire to want to use that energy in a way that can actually help people connect to truth and more wisdom and expansion and consciousness. So there's a strong pulsating desire and motivation to want to work with that energy on that level, you could say. Yeah, pretty much covered that. Okay, just a couple more things. So the other thing that you would need to take into consideration, of course, is the sign that this retrograde, well, first of all, the retrograde planet. Second of all, the sign that it's in. The house that it's in, again, it's the same drill, you know, sign, house, aspects. But with the aspects, with retrograde planets, it's not very different to reading aspects in a chart. You know, generally, in fact, it's the same, but you're kind of looking for a couple of other things. And, you know, stressful aspects can, such as squares and oppositions, particularly squares. Oppositions always polarize the energy. So, you know, if somebody's got a Mars-Saturn opposition in their chart, for example, the most common or typical experience of that energy is that the individual, the soul, will connect very strongly to the Mars. They'll be the Mars, and then they'll polarize the Saturn energy. So they experience strong resistances from authoritarian figures, you know, and that usually starts with the father, you know, early on in life. So oppositions polarize energy until the person develops enough awareness to actually illuminate the energy within. So oppositions ultimately create illumination and awareness, but initially, typically how they are expressed is that they'll take on the energy of one planet and project the other, just like the example I gave of Mars-Saturn. So stressful aspect squares with retrograde planets can be quite tough. They can make it quite difficult for the person to work through what it is they need to work through on that internal level. They can pose a lot of challenges and blocks and resistances, psychologically, you know, spiritually, emotionally, etc. There's much more to it than that, obviously, but I'm just giving you a brief example. And particularly if you've got a retrograde planet in your chart that's forming a hard aspect to your ascendant, for example. So say you had Mars retrograde and it was squaring your ascendant. That's a really, really tough aspect, because the ascendant is self-expression, the emergence of self. It's a very subjective energy, the ascendant, but it is you seeing through the particular filters that you're seeing through in terms of everything in your life. And even though I've talked about Pluto being the planet that connects to the soul, that's based on Jeffrey Wolf Green's work, which I thoroughly feel very strongly connected to. In esoteric astrology, though, the ascendant is the vehicle of the soul. So I still hold on to that particular way of viewing the chart as well. So, yeah, but getting back to a retrograde planet squaring the ascendant, in this case Mars, as I use that example, if it's square the ascendant, then it can really pose some difficulties for the individual to be able to express their soul and their self, and as a result can make the person withdraw quite a lot from life, and as a result of that feel quite isolated, can make the person feel quite disconnected in a way. Essentially because the person struggles to feel understood in the way in which they see life, view life, and how they are working with life and their own life. However, you know, on the opposite flip side to that, you know, if you've got supportive aspects with retrograde planets to other planets, then clearly that's going to indicate a much smoother flow and ease of energies supporting that retrograde planet's function and pathway to illuminating and working through some past life issues perhaps, and patterns, themes, undercurrents that are unresolved due to the way the person lived in a previous incarnation or various previous incarnations. So I'll just wrap it up with some key words that I'll give you relating to when a retrograde planet is operating on a optimum constructive level, and when it's operating on a non-productive or challenged level. So let's start with positive ones first. The constructive keywords would be meditative, profound, deep awareness, inner strength, spiritual power, deep ability to be incredibly reflective, powerful self-knowledge, humility, self-attunement, universal identity, and subtle. So the energy is a very subtle energy. Those are the key words that you could relate to a retrograde planet when it's actually operating in a productive, constructive, enlightened way. A challenged retrograde planet would be possibly withdrawn, inhibited, blockage of outer awareness, because remember, retrograde planets are quite subjective in nature, especially to begin with. Maladjustment, repression, self-undoing, evasive in nature, and health problems can occur with retrograde planets, particularly on a psychological level, so mental level. Okay, I'll leave it there for now, but this was an introduction, and the next part of this would be to perhaps I'll do a video on the retrograde planets in the different signs, and what it means to have Mercury retrograde, Mars retrograde, Venus retrograde, etc., because they all each have their own individual meaning, and yes, then perhaps we could maybe look at some aspects as well. But there you go, there's an introduction for you. Hopefully it's helpful and useful, and thank you for watching, and thank you for subscribing, and thanks for your questions and comments. I really appreciate them. I say this at the end of every video, I think, because it is important. Like I said earlier when I started this video, a comment I made about Venus in Virgo, and I can see why when I look back at my own video, how that can be taken in an entirely different context to what my intention was. So your questions are important. I am objective enough, and I think I'm conscious enough to take feedback on all the different levels that it arises. I'm not perfect. I'm not saying that I know everything about astrology. I have been working with astrology for 20 years. It is a long time, so I'm not a beginner, but I'm certainly continuously learning more and more and more, and I will be until the end of this life, until I take my last breath, and then I rest and choose to take another life. So, astrology is so incredibly powerful on so many levels, and there is no end point with how much one can learn. For a start, there's so many branches of astrology, so it depends which branch you begin to explore and develop and evolve as well. But ultimately, I think astrology is a very powerful wisdom that essentially expands your consciousness and gives you great awareness and direction with your path, whatever your chosen path may be. It just adds tremendous awareness, understanding, and insight into so many components of your own life and other people's lives and the world at large. So again, thanks for watching, guys. Appreciate it, and see you soon. Bye.